They called it a field piece and a polite joke. To the gray-clad men eating hardtack behind sandbags, and to the officers whose childhood lessons were built around tales of siege and hammer, the 105mm gun looked, at a glance, like a compromise. Not a siege mortar, not a beastly railway gun that could tear bridges from their piers with a single hour-long barrage. It was middling in scale, a weapon of maneuver. Mobile enough to follow an advancing column, accurate enough to pin down an enemy flank, but in the minds of many on the Axis side, it simply lacked the appetite for the kind of architectural violence a major river crossing demanded. In letters and mess hall banter, German and Italian soldiers would shrug and say, half in derision, that the Americans were bringing garden cannons to a demolition job. They expected the familiar theater of war, heavy guns for heavy work and light guns for everything else. This contempt did not arise from ignorance alone. The theater of Italy in 1943-1944 was a geography that favored cynicism. Mountains fell into rivers like broken teeth. Historic bridges, stone arches, and riveted steel spans had borne traffic for generations and had been bolstered by engineers who understood how to make a crossing stubborn. Key choke points were narrow, built into cliff faces or tied to a single causeway across marsh. Against such hardened engineering, the logic seemed obvious. You needed a big shell to upset masonry, a long, patient blast to force a structure to yield. The 105, with its tractable carriage and emphasis on mobility, seemed designed for strafing columns and shelling enemy assembly points, not for ending a bridge's life. So when Allied artillerymen first unlimbered their 105s near the roads that fed Anzio's tenuous lodgment or the lanes that threaded the Tracine Basin, they were watched with more curiosity than dread. Enemy observers recorded the pieces, made a note of calibers and probable ranges, and then filed the sighting under minor threat. Men in dugouts heard the new guns bark and smirked. Let them spend their shells, they thought. The real defenses were stronger. The engineers of the Reich had built redundancies. Laughable, some said, and their laughter ran along radio wavelengths and through letters home. But the mockery had two dangerous assumptions: that structural destruction was solely a function of shell size, and that a bridge's death required its total collapse. Neither were true. Bridges are not only lumps of stone and metal, they are systems. Trusses and rivets, abutments and bearings, a handful of carefully placed hits could undo an entire conduit's capacity to carry weight without toppling every arch. Disable the joints, sever the bearings, set supply vehicles ablaze on the deck, and you have done what a city-bound artillery plan would take weeks to attempt. The 105's designers had not sought to invent a Leviathan. They had engineered a precision instrument meant to exploit human and structural vulnerabilities, to make small holes that yielded tactical paralysis. The American crews knew this even before the first decisive strikes. Their briefings were practical rather than boastful. Observers in the field, often risking themselves within whispering distance of enemy positions, learned to read the anatomy of a crossing. They studied the camera-like diagrams of moles and bearings, noted where the metal flanges met masonry, and marked likely weak points that heavier shells would waste time searching for. Mobility was their advantage. The 105 could be moved forward on a motor truck, unlimbered in a narrow shoulder of roadway, and trained quickly on an exposed moldering joint. The dictum of the gunners was simple and stubborn: find the seam and exploit it. So the crews worked quietly. They practiced ranging against old culverts and abandoned spans, tuning fuse timing and experimenting with angles of impact. In bivouac, where the smell of coffee mixed with grease and the herd song of the generators, artillerymen swapped cynical stories about the enemy's certainty that size alone settled arguments. Let them laugh, one gunner is remembered as saying in the mess. No bravado, just a tired smile. We'll teach them geometry. That geometry would prove cruel and elegant in equal measure. The first time a 105 round struck the mortar junction of a mid-sized bridge near a supply road, it did not topple the arch in cinematic fashion. Instead, it sheared a rivet, cracked the casing around a bearing, and sent a fine, fatal fissure along the underside of the deck. The material held for a heartbeat, and then, under the weight of a passing lorry filled with troops and fuel, the deck sagged, buckled, and spat flame. The convoy behind it halted as if a hand had slammed on an invisible brake. Vehicles at the rear, seeing the black smoke and smelling the gasoline, abandoned their loads. Ammunition cooks began to detonate with a small, terrifying rhetoric of sparks. What the Axis had believed required lumbering howitzers to achieve had been enacted by a single, well-placed 105 round. Word of such strikes spread fast, not in official communiques, but in terrified whispers and the hard lines of interrogation reports. The mocking smile of the German colonels softened into disbelief once or twice. The radio banter grew cautious. A lieutenant who had joked about garden cannons found his evening watch invaded by the memory of burning trucks and the dead weight of a halted column. Where they had once seen a courtesy weapon, now they glimpsed the arithmetic of interdiction. A bridge that could not carry reinforcements was a tactical victory in itself. Supply lines choked, commanders lost the freedom of maneuver, and morale, that fragile commodity, sank in proportion to the convoy delays. On the Allied side, the men who manned the 105s did not celebrate like conquering heroes. Their satisfaction was quieter, a catalogue of small victories in the ledger of war. They learned to move fast, to take cover, to coordinate with reconnaissance elements and the Corps of Engineers. Where the gun's weight had once seemed a handicap against masonry, its very mobility became the asset that allowed it to strike where large pieces could not quickly be emplaced. They read maps differently now. They looked for dependence more than grandeur, for a single artery that, once severed, would cause the enemy to bleed and stall. The sneer, so common at first, began to wither. Men who had scoffed learned to listen to the distant, methodical bark of the 105 with a new, resentful respect. It was not the brash roar of terror that toppled monuments, but a cooler, surgical thunder that ate at the enemy's options. The opera of artillery had changed its rhythm. The 105 did not shatter everything it touched, but it rendered movement meaningless. And in war, meaning is the most dangerous thing of all. The 105mm M2A1 howitzer wasn't the loudest gun in Europe, but it was, perhaps, the smartest. To those who served it, it was an instrument, not a monster. Its barrel, just over 7 feet long, sat balanced on a light carriage. A trained crew could emplace it in under 3 minutes, fire 6 rounds per minute, and then move it again before the enemy could triangulate its position. It wasn't built to intimidate through size, but to define precision through adaptability, a paradox the Germans would come to understand far too late. The 105 had a firing range of just over 7 miles, with a muzzle velocity of around 1,550 feet per second. It could hurl a 33-pound, 15 kilograms, shell across valleys, ridges, and rivers, striking with brutal accuracy when guided by skilled forward observers. The standard high-explosive HE shell, the M1 type, carried 4.8 pounds of TNT, packed inside a thin steel casing engineered to fragment cleanly. Upon detonation, it sent steel splinters screaming in every direction at speeds exceeding 3,000 feet per second, enough to shred vehicles, unarmored emplacements, and human flesh alike. But its most dangerous gift was pressure, the invisible wave that could break concrete, split seams, and rattle bolts loose on the kind of bridges the Axis considered unbreakable. To understand the 105's genius, one must look not at the shell, but at its arc. Unlike larger, flatter-firing guns, the 105 was designed for flexibility. It could lob shells in high parabolic trajectories, letting gravity itself do the killing. Instead of battering a bridge from the front, it rained destruction from above, striking weak points, decks, junctions, fuel trucks that were never meant to take vertical impact. On the open plains of northern Italy, where mountains funneled every road toward a river or viaduct, that capability made it a scalpel in the hands of men who knew anatomy. American artillery doctrine had evolved around the idea of indirect fire, the notion that one could destroy without being seen. By 1943, this concept had matured into a dance of mathematics, communication, and nerve. The gunners rarely saw what they killed. They worked from coordinates, fed by observers with binoculars, or by reconnaissance pilots sketching bridges on napkins in their cockpits. A single radioed correction, left 50, drop 100, fire for effect, could mean the difference between a miss and a masterpiece. Each shot was a calculated risk. The howitzer's recoil spades bit deep into the mud. The breech blocks slammed open and closed like a heartbeat. The crew moved as one: loader, breechman, pointer, gunner, fuse setter, their motions practiced until they bordered on ritual. They knew that one wrong elevation, one misread wind could send a shell into empty farmland or too far downrange into friendly lines. But when it worked, when they felt the ground quiver just right, they would smile, not out of pride, but out of recognition. They had touched the geometry of war.
The Germans, for all their engineering brilliance, underestimated that geometry. Their artillery favored brute force. The 150 and 170 millimeter guns were devastating in open bombardment, but sluggish, hard to move, and wasteful against small targets. The 105, quick, light, accurate, exploited the one vulnerability every modern army shared: dependence on movement. The Americans didn't need to destroy everything. They needed only to destroy the right thing. During the Italian campaign, that right thing was often a bridge. The terrain turned every span into a bottleneck, every river into a trap. Axis engineers reinforced crossings with concrete and steel plates, confident that only large-caliber siege guns could breach them. But the 105 didn't need to breach. It needed to disable. The trick lay in understanding how bridges behaved under stress, a lesson learned not from textbooks, but from battlefield improvisation. At Anzio, a forward observer named Lieutenant Charles Whitaker studied an enemy bridge through his field glasses. He noticed that every German truck crossing it slowed at a specific joint, the point where the steel deck met the masonry abutment. "Hit that seam," he radioed to the battery. The first salvo missed. The second landed close enough to send a plume of water and dust. The third, adjusted by just 50 yards, hit home. It didn't blow the bridge apart. Instead, it cracked the bearing plate, dislodged the rivets, and set the structure trembling. Moments later, a half-track carrying ammunition tried to cross. The weakened joint gave way. The truck plunged into the river below, its explosion lighting the night like a torch. The bridge didn't need to fall. It was dead all the same. That was the secret. The 105 smaller shell could be placed more precisely, fired faster, and adjusted mid-battle without requiring massive logistical preparation. The Americans learned to fire in sequences, 3 shells per bridge span, each spaced by 10 seconds. The first jarred the structure, the second exploited the vibration, and the third finished the job. When coupled with spotting rounds of white phosphorus or smoke, they could walk the explosions along a target as if tracing a finger across a map. To the engineers who worked alongside them, this cooperation between artillery and reconnaissance was revolutionary. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, often derided as mere builders and roadmen, became the silent partners in destruction. They advised gunners where to aim for maximum crippling effect, then sealed the enemy's fate by mining secondary roads, detonating culverts, or felling trees to block detours. It was a symphony of precision, the 105 firing, the engineers waiting, the sky briefly silent before the echo rolled back from the valley walls. And when the smoke cleared, there was always the same image: a bridge half standing, twisted and smoking, its deck sunken like a broken spine. To the Germans, this was infuriating. To the Americans, it was art. One German after-action report recovered from the Trasimene sector read bitterly: "The enemy artillery employed small-caliber field guns, but with unacceptable precision. Their fire did not demolish, it paralyzed. Road junctions and bridges were rendered useless with minimal expenditure. It is as if they see through the smoke." That precision was not magic, it was the product of discipline and trust. Every 105 crew had spent months learning the language of trajectory and time. They knew that war was not only about explosions, it was about placement. When a bridge fell silent after a 105 barrage, the message was unmistakable. Intelligence, coordination, and restraint had triumphed. By the end of 1943, the Germans no longer laughed at the 105. They had learned the hard way that small calibers could speak with devastating eloquence. The weapon they once mocked had become a whisper of death. A weapon that didn't need to roar to be feared. But the gun's full potential, the proof that its precision could rewrite the rules of destruction, would only be realized in the battles to come, when the fields of Anzio and Trasimene turned into testing grounds of nerve, ingenuity, and sacrifice. There, the 105 would stop being just a gun. It would become a legend. One shell, one bridge, one turning point at a time.
It began in the rain. The Italian sky, heavy with February mist, hung low over the coastal marshes of Anzio. Every sound, boots squelching in the mud, the metallic cough of engines, the whisper of distant artillery,
was swallowed by fog. To the German commanders watching through binoculars, the American positions looked pinned and fragile. They believed the Allied beachhead could be strangled with one coordinated strike. Supply lines were thin, bridges few, and the terrain unforgiving. "Cut their roads," General Everhard von Mackensen told his staff. "They will wither where they stand." But someone else had thought the same, and faster. On the American side, Battery C of the 33rd Field Artillery Battalion had been awake since before dawn. 6 105mm howitzers sat hidden under camouflage nets of burlap and mud, barrels angled toward the faint silhouette of the Aprilia Cisterna Bridge, a lifeline for the enemy's counterattack. The bridge was old Roman stone under German steel, a hybrid of centuries of empire, and it carried everything: fuel, ammunition, reinforcements. The men who served the guns didn't know its history, only its coordinates. Grid 279845, elevation 22 degrees, fuse delay 0.15 seconds. Lieutenant Charles Whitaker, the same forward observer who had cracked the Trasimene Bridge weeks before, crouched in a church tower half a mile away, peering through his scope as the dawn broke pale and silver. His voice on the radio was calm. "Battery C, this is Spotter 2. You may fire when ready." The order traveled through static, through human hands, through the hiss of fuses and the tightening of muscles. Then came the first report. Thud. The ground trembled. Shell number 1 traced a perfect arc through the fog, vanishing into silence. A heartbeat later, the horizon bloomed orange. Left 20, drop 50, fire for effect. The second shell landed directly on the bridge's northern abutment. The observers saw a burst of dust and metal, then a cloud of smoke rising like ink in water. Whitaker's pencil scratched quickly on his notepad. Bearing shifted. Bridge struck. Target confirmed. From behind the lines, Sergeant Paul DeLuca, the battery's chief of section, shouted over the roar. "Load, fuse same." The crew moved like a single body. One man swung the breech, another shoved the shell in, a third adjusted the transverse. Sweat mingled with rain and oil. They didn't look at the sky. They looked at their gun, at their captain, at each other. The third volley came like punctuation. 6 shells, perfectly timed, landed across the bridge's deck in 10-second intervals. The structure shuddered. German trucks had just begun crossing, the first carrying ammunition, the second fuel. The 5th shell hit between them. The explosion tore open the convoy like paper. Fire leapt upward, devouring the trucks in seconds. The smoke rose black and thick, the color of burned rubber and oil. By noon, the bridge was impassable. Its arch still stood, stubborn as bone, but the roadway was gone, a twisted ribbon of steel and stone. The German counterattack stalled. The radio chatter that morning, once confident, turned frantic. Road blocked, bridge destroyed, vehicles burning. The words carried across open channels before they were drowned by static. That day, the 105 proved what the engineers had suspected all along. You didn't have to erase a structure to end its usefulness. You only had to hurt it where it mattered most. Meanwhile, 150 miles north, another drama unfolded near Lake Trasimene, the same region where Hannibal had ambushed a Roman army 2 millennia earlier. Now, in June 1944, the battlefield echoed with a different thunder. German armored units retreating from Rome were funneling across the Pasignano Bridge, a slender crossing of iron beams over a swollen river. It was the last route before the Allies could cut them off completely. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, working with a forward element of the 91st Infantry Division, planned a coordinated strike. The engineers would plant charges on the western abutment once the enemy withdrew,
while the 105mm batteries would fire from the ridge to the east to cover them and, if possible, destroy the bridge outright. It was a mission written in pencil, smudged by rain and risk. At 1600 hours, the observers spotted movement. 2 German half-tracks, followed by a Panther tank. The engineers froze, pressed against the mud. Above them, the American guns opened up. The 105s fired in sequence, single shots, slow and deliberate. The first rounds landed short, throwing fountains of water. The Germans hesitated, scanning the horizon. The next volley found its mark. The second shell struck the midpoint of the bridge. The explosion sent beams twisting upward like ribs. The Panther lurched forward, then stopped, its treads jammed in the wreckage. The tank commander shouted orders. The driver reversed. A third round hit the far abutment, collapsing a section of decking. The Panther slid sideways, teetered, and then fell, nose first, into the river below. The engineers watched in disbelief. Their charges were no longer needed. The 105s had done the job. "Jesus Christ," one of them whispered. "They blew it clean without even touching it." When the firing stopped, the valley went eerily still. The only sounds were the creak of twisted iron and the hiss of steam rising from the burning tank. A German officer on the far bank shouted commands no one obeyed. His men stared across the water at the wrecked span, at the bridge that had been their lifeline. In the aftermath, the Allies moved quickly. With the bridges gone, the German withdrawal turned chaotic. Convoys diverted onto secondary roads too narrow for their vehicles. Abandoned trucks littered the ditches, engines still smoking. In the confusion, retreat turned into rout. Captured diaries later revealed how deeply the shock had set in. One German captain wrote bitterly, "We were told the American field guns were too light to threaten our crossings. I watched a bridge vanish in less than 5 minutes. It was not bombardment. It was surgery." For the men who had fired the 105s, it was vindication, not of arrogance, but of craftsmanship. They had spent months honing their aim, trusting the math, the angles, the instinct that came from repetition. To see the enemy's pride undone by a few dozen rounds felt less like victory and more like proof. Proof that discipline could outthink strength. As the smoke cleared over Anzio and Trasimene, even the engineers, hardened men who built and destroyed with equal precision, stood silent for a moment, watching the remains of their work drift downriver. Bridges, like wars, were easy to start and hard to end. When word of the twin strikes reached headquarters, one staff officer simply nodded and said, "They mocked the 105. They won't again." From then on, no German convoy crossed a bridge within range of an American howitzer without glancing up at the hills, waiting for the sound of thunder that never missed its mark.
War is often remembered in tonnage, calibers, ranges, payloads, but its victories are written in inches and human will. Behind every thunderous 105mm shell fired at Anzio or Trasimene was not just a weapon, but a collection of nerves, sweat, and breath, the men who served the gun. They were mechanics of destruction and artisans of precision, each movement rehearsed in exhaustion until it became reflex. Yet even perfection needed courage, because the 105's brilliance depended not on size, but on how far its crew dared to bring it forward. The Italian campaign forced artillerymen into a new kind of war. Mountains that devoured sound and valleys that hid the enemy's approach meant they had to fight close, dangerously close. The 105, designed as a medium field piece, became a frontline gun, dragged through vineyards and over rocky slopes by mules, trucks, and when the engines failed, by men with ropes biting into their palms. Every mile felt like a mile closer to God, one gunner wrote, half prayer, half joke. Among them was Sergeant Paul DeLuca, a Brooklyn-born carpenter before the war, now chief of section for Battery C. His men called him the Level because his hands never shook, even under fire. During the Anzio offensive, when orders came to push the guns forward into an olive grove just 800 yards behind the infantry line, DeLuca didn't flinch. If they need us that close, then that's where we belong. The crew spent the night hauling their M2A1 through waist-deep mud, the wheels sinking with every pull. By dawn, the barrels were black with soot and rain. The men hadn't eaten, but the gun was ready, and that was all that mattered. At dawn, the counter-battery fire started. German 88mm shells tore through the grove, splintering trees into jagged spears. DeLuca's loader, Private First Class Hayes, lost his helmet to shrapnel and kept loading. The spotter's radio went dead, so they fired by dead reckoning, adjusting by instinct, counting seconds between report and impact. "She walks true," Hayes muttered, as another shell left the barrel, the sound swallowed by the forest. When word came later that their rounds had cut a convoy trying to reach the Aprilia Bridge, DeLuca didn't cheer. He just wiped his hands and said, "Good, let's load again." Across the valleys, men of the Army Corps of Engineers performed their own miracles in mud. If the artillery was the hammer, the engineers were the hand guiding the blow. They built, they destroyed, and sometimes they did both in the same hour. Their mission during the Italian campaign was brutal in its logic: deny the enemy mobility. Bridges that had once been lifelines became death traps, and it was the engineers' job to make sure the 105s knew exactly where to aim. Captain Ernest Mallory, commanding an engineer platoon near Trasimene, recalled one of those nights. His men crept through the reeds under German machine gun fire, measuring bridge spans with tape and flashlight. "We had to map the weak points before daylight," he later said. "If the gunners couldn't see, we had to be their eyes." They finished just before dawn, cold and soaked. 2 hours later, the 105s opened fire using coordinates they had risked their lives to gather. The bridge collapsed by noon. Mallory never saw the destruction, but when the radio confirmed success, he allowed himself a single weary nod. "Worth every inch," he whispered. The cooperation between artillery and engineers became a symphony of survival. Forward observers like Whitaker relayed positions, engineers confirmed targets, and gunners translated those details into controlled fury. Each group trusted the other absolutely. There was no room for ego, no margin for error. A misplaced shell could kill a friendly patrol as easily as the enemy. Theirs was a partnership forged not by orders, but by necessity. On the ground, it looked like chaos, men shouting over radio static, trucks stuck in ditches, shells screaming overhead. But inside that chaos was order, a rhythm that could only exist among those who had lived too long in danger. One artillery lieutenant described it years later. "It was like jazz. Everyone had their part, and when it came together, you just knew. You didn't think about fear until it was over." Fear, of course, was always there. The gunners rarely admitted it, but it haunted the quiet between salvos. Every time the breech slammed shut, every time the fuse hissed, they knew the next shell might bring retaliation. German counter-battery crews were relentless, their 150s and 170s hunting flashes on the horizon. Entire batteries vanished under sudden fire. A misjudged emplacement, a delay in movement, and the world would end in dust and flame. Still, they fired. Courage in that world wasn't loud. It was in the loader's steady hand, the gunner's voice cracking from smoke, the engineer who crawled back for one more measurement under a bridge ready to fall. It was the quiet handshake between branches that normally never met, artillerymen thanking engineers for a map that saved lives, engineers thanking the guns that erased a crossing they had marked hours before. When the bridges at Anzio and Trasimene finally fell, the story spread faster than official reports. Rumors told of phantom gunners who could thread shells through fog, of engineers who could smell steel fatigue from a mile away. The truth was simpler and more human. It was trust. Trust built in mud, under fire, through sleepless nights and impossible odds. In one small Italian town near the Tiber, villagers watched an American battery pass after the fighting. Their children ran alongside the column, touching the barrels as if they were relics. An old woman crossed herself and said softly,
piccolo cannone, grande tuono. She didn't know how right she was. That phrase followed the battery for the rest of the campaign. The men painted it in chalk on their gun shields, half joke, half truth. And when they next fired, at another bridge, another artery the enemy thought untouchable, they whispered it again, like a prayer to the machine that had become their constant companion. The 105 had never been about intimidation. It was about finesse, about making something as crude as war behave with the precision of a craftsman's hand. And the men who served it, gunners, spotters, engineers alike, understood that they were not simply breaking stone and steel. They were unmaking arrogance. By the time the German army retreated north, the bridges they once mocked lay in ruin, not from massive guns or bombing raids, but from weapons once dismissed as toys, wielded by men who had learned to make the impossible look effortless. In the end, that was the human factor. Courage shaped into discipline, fear refined into accuracy, and teamwork turned into art. The 105 didn't just fire shells, it fired belief that small men with small guns could still bend empires.
By the spring of 1944, Italy had become a graveyard of bridges. From Salerno to Florence, spans that once carried centuries of trade and empire now lay broken in the rivers, twisted like ribs, their iron guts exposed to the sky. Many had not fallen to air raids or massive 155mm siege guns, but to the steady, deliberate hands of the 105 crews, the small guns that nobody had feared. The Germans, who once joked that a 105 shell could only chip paint, now marked its range on their maps in red, and their convoys waited for darkness before crossing. The lesson had been carved into both earth and doctrine. In modern war, precision outweighed magnitude. The 105mm M2A1 had proved that smaller artillery, properly coordinated with engineers and reconnaissance, could do the work of giants. The Anzio bridgehead had survived because of that truth. When supply lines faltered, it was the mobility of the 105s that saved the beachhead. They shifted positions through swamp and vineyard, silencing counterattacks that heavier guns could never reach in time. At Trasimene, that same adaptability turned retreat into collapse. The German army's legendary efficiency had met something it could not calculate, a weapon wielded not by size, but by understanding. After those victories, the Allied press printed stories about the little gun that stopped tanks, but among the soldiers, the praise was quieter. They spoke instead of discipline, of crews who knew how to fold science into instinct. The success of the 105 had been built not on heroics, but on trust. Spotters feeding coordinates through static, engineers sketching weak points by flashlight, and gunners who fired blind into the fog, confident that someone, somewhere had done the math right. It was cooperation, invisible, methodical, human, that turned the gun into a scalpel. Even the German High Command took note. In captured correspondence from the 10th Army, one officer wrote, almost grudgingly, "The Americans have perfected the art of small-caliber interdiction. They do not destroy the landscape, only what we need most." The 105 had rewritten the physics of destruction. It did not flatten cities or erase ridges. It interrupted the enemy's logic, cutting roads, bridges, and choke points until movement itself became impossible. What began as tactical precision grew into strategy. Each bridge destroyed at Anzio delayed reinforcements. Each convoy trapped at Trasimene choked the front line of fuel and ammunition. The 105 turned terrain into a weapon, forcing the enemy to fight the earth itself. By the time the Allies crossed the Arno and pushed toward the Gothic line, the 105 was everywhere. Its sound became the war's background hum, that deep, rhythmic pulse that marked the slow, inevitable grind of progress. Infantrymen called it our guardian thunder. They learned to read its rhythm. The first distant thump meant relief, the second, safety. A platoon pinned in a vineyard would look to the sky, hear the whistle of incoming shells, and know that somewhere, unseen, a battery was working for them. When the war in Europe finally ended, the M2A1's record was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of rounds fired across Africa, Italy, France, and Germany. Bridges collapsed, fortifications neutralized, assaults broken before they began. It had become the backbone of Allied artillery doctrine, a symbol of American efficiency and engineering. But its true legacy was subtler. It had taught a generation of soldiers that technology and courage were inseparable. Precision, after all, demanded nerve. In the years that followed, armies around the world studied the 105's campaign reports. The Soviets, British, and even the newly reformed Bundeswehr adapted their own doctrines around flexible, medium-caliber artillery, the thinking man's gun. Manuals emphasized cooperation between gunners and engineers and the art of structural targeting. Military academies began teaching what Anzio had proven, that destruction was a science of pressure points, not just firepower. Yet for the men who had fired the 105, the legacy was not academic. It was visceral. They remembered the recoil in their bones, the smell of burnt cordite, and the sight of a bridge folding into itself after the last round. They remembered what it felt like to be dismissed, to hear the enemy laugh at their toy cannon, and the silence that followed when that cannon turned laughter into rubble. Sergeant DeLuca, the Brooklyn carpenter turned gun chief, returned home with a small brass fragment he'd kept from Anzio. He mounted it in a block of wood and carved a simple line beneath, "Measured, not mighty." It was his summary of the war, and perhaps of all war. The 105 story, repeated in barracks and reunions, became a quiet anthem of humility. It reminded soldiers that ingenuity could triumph where brute strength failed, that coordination could amplify courage, and that respect for the weapon, the men beside you, and even the enemy, was the thin thread between victory and chaos. Today, in museums from Fort Sill to Casino, the M2A1 sits behind glass, its olive paint dulled by time. Tourists glance at it briefly, unaware that this modest gun once shattered empire's confidence. Its specifications are printed on a small plaque: caliber, 105 millimeters, crew, 8, range, 12,000 yards. But the real inscription is invisible, written in the silence of every bridge it destroyed: underestimate nothing well aimed. For those who served it, the memory endures. They can still hear the distant roll of thunder over Italian hills, see the glow on the horizon where steel once stood proud, and feel the satisfaction that comes when the smallest hand makes the largest change. Because, in 1944, in the mud and fire of Italy, the gun they mocked proved something eternal: that precision is power, and power, when wielded with discipline, can reshape the course of a war. The 105 didn't just blow bridges apart. It bridged the gap between doubt and belief, and silenced every laugh that once echoed across the valley.